Chapter 11. The Controversy. For the Lord hath a controversy with the nations, he will plead with all flesh, he will give them that are wicked to the sword, saith the Lord. Jer. 25:31. The controversy between the world and the Mormon religion is well known. As soon as the doctrines of Mormonism were revealed, the other religions of the world began to contend against them. Jesus said, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." Matt. 10:34. Mormonism, being the same gospel that Jesus taught, created the same opposition and the same sword. Because of their beliefs and practices, thousands of Mormons have had their blood shed by their enemies. The purpose of this chapter is to illustrate the controversy that has existed and still exists between those doctrines revealed to Joseph Smith, among which is blood atonement, and those of the non-Mormons. The following quotations and illustrations show that the original doctrines of Mormonism and the doctrines of the rest of the world are still unreconciled. Degeneracy of the world. The majority of this nation have participated in or have in some way sanctioned mobbings, rioting, burning their own cities, killing their own unborn offspring, and even murdering when the price was high enough. In such a fallen condition, they think that the Mormons are wicked and deceived. They are quick to believe and accept anything that is slanderous or unfavorable about the Mormons. Brigham Young explained, "You can imagine what you please of the stories you have read about the people of Utah from the pens of every lying scribbler who has been here. Imagine what you please, but write this down, publish it in your little papers, that a saint will never do wrong if he knows it. If a man will do a wrong thing willfully, he is not a saint." When you hear of Brigham Young, and of his brethren who are in the faith of the Holy Gospel, doing this wrong and that wrong, wait until you find out the truth before you publish it to the world. We have been asked a good many times, why do you not publish the truth in regard to those lies which are circulated about you? We might do this if we owned all the papers published in Christendom. Who will publish a letter from mere my brethren? Who will publish the truth from us? If it gets into one paper, it is slipped under the counter or somewhere else, but it never gets into a second. They will send forth lies concerning us very readily. The old adage is that a lie will creep through the keyhole and go 1,000 miles, while truth is getting out of doors, and our experience has proved this. J.D. 13:177. How the world looks at Mormonism. Picture of white sheep in circle glaring at black sheep in middle of circle. But maybe it's the other way around. Picture of black sheep in circle glaring at white sheep in middle of circle. This nation prides itself on its computerized technology, splitting the atom, and sending men to the moon. But newspaper headlines illustrate that morality is degenerating as fast as science is advancing. Found guilty. Murder. Rape suspects face trial. Robbery suspect gets new trial date. Woman strangled, jury says Magna man is guilty in slaying. Prison term given in sexual abuse. Burglar sentenced. Rising crime rates. Rape suspect seized. Terror groups to advance. 3 witnesses describe sniper shootings. And deaths of 2. Gunshot in kills Utah salesman. Police note theft rise. Slay conviction. Crime. Bombing. America, like the other nations, suffers from its own fallen and corrupt delusions, but their viciousness and moral depravity runs deeper than most people are willing to believe. The Associated Press released an article in Chicago that illustrates how far the moral conscience of Americans has eroded. Many claim they would kill if the price is right. Chicago, AP. What is the least amount of money you would take to push a button to kill a person inside a black box? No one would ever know what you did. A psychologist put that question to 200 persons around Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, D.C. in 1975, and to an additional 452 persons interviewed this year in St. Mary's County, Maryland. Their answers, said Dr. Paul Cameron, point to a disregard for the value of human life in American society. The people interviewed were divided into 2 groups: those who acknowledged having deliberately killed someone, usually in military service, or having tried to do so, were in one group. Those who had never killed or tried to were in the second group. 45% of those who had killed before said they would murder for money, Cameron said. The average price for them was $20,000. Of those who had never killed or tried to, 25% said they would do it, and their average price was $50,000, he said. Lethality feeds upon itself, said Cameron, who teaches now at the Graduate School of Psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, Calif. He formerly taught in Maryland and did the studies at that time. Cameron reported on his work recently at the annual meeting of the National Federation of Catholic Physicians Guilds in Oak Brook, Ill. He elaborated in a telephone interview. Cameron said an estimated 20 million persons in the United States have participated in killing humans in various contexts. Their attitudes toward life cannot help but influence our society in a deathward direction, he said. Part of the lethal trend toward death is the growing power of the military mind in our society. Returning military personnel do not, as Americans tend to think, just come home and eat apples, bake pies, have children, Cameron said. They return with a different, more lethal view toward life, he said, and this is passed on to their children. Justice versus injustice. The prophet Joseph Smith gave a clear definition of true justice when he said that we believe that the commission of crime should be punished according to the nature of the offense. D&C 134:8. In other words, the punishment should be equal to the crime. The world, however, has difficulty in administering justice, as seen in these two examples that were published on the same day in the same newspaper. Court denies appeal. Washington. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 Tuesday a man's life sentence for committing 3 frauds totaling $229.11 is not cruel and unusual punishment forbidden by the Constitution. William James Rummel, 36, who has been imprisoned since 1973, is being held at Angleton, Texas. His attorney, Scott Atlas, decried the outcome, saying, "It demeans our system of justice if we impose our harshest penalty short of death for nonviolent crimes, while a violent criminal may receive a much shorter sentence." Salt Lake Tribune, March 19, 1980. Victims' graves found. Quito, Ecuador police have recovered the bodies of 21 girls from secret graves after a Colombian fugitive confessed to raping and strangling about 100 girls over the last 7 years, police said Tuesday. Pedro Alonso Lopez, 38, who was arrested 2 weeks ago in the southern town of Ambato, told police the girls were all aged 13 or under. He said he fled from Colombia in 1973 to avoid arrest for similar crimes there. Police said Lopez told them he usually made friends with poor girls, most of them street vendors, took them to isolated spots, raped them, and then strangled them to death. Lopez faces a maximum sentence of 16 years in prison. Salt Lake Tribune. The United States Supreme Court has lately become more concerned for the rights of violent criminals than those of the victims and their families. For example, in Southern California, a girl by the name of Patty Hopkins and her date were approached by 2 men with guns. The men kidnapped and raped Patty and then forced her into the trunk of a car. One of the men then emptied his gun into the trunk, leaving Patty unable to ever walk again. The man who raped and shot her will be eligible for parole in 7 years. Cartoon caption: Supreme Court bans death penalty for rape. The fight for capital punishment. Capital punishment in America came from the English common law, which was administered to protect society from the most violent criminals. It was a law when the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were adopted, including the 8th Amendment concerning cruel and unusual punishment, which is so often thrown against capital punishment, as in the Furman v. Georgia case in 1972. For 100 years after the adoption of the Bill of Rights, there was not a challenge to the constitutionality of capital punishment. The clause of cruel and unusual referred to tortures, barbarity, and atrocious inhuman punishments that have existed in some foreign countries. The men who wrote the Constitution saw nothing illegal or morally wrong with capital punishment. On January 25, 1980, the attorney generals from 26 of the 36 states with capital punishment statutes met in Salt Lake City for a first-time seminar on capital punishment. It was to better understand the law and prepare better arguments against organizations that were opposing capital punishment. Utah Attorney General Robert Hansen said, "I think we are going to have to fight for capital punishment on a philosophical level as well as in the courtroom." Salt Lake Tribune, January 25, 1980. The next day, Attorney Hansen is reported to have said, "All life is not equally valuable. It is the quality of life that is of value and in need of protection. The death penalty does not cheapen life, it increases the value of life and elevates the importance we attach to it. For the death penalty to have its greatest deterrent effectiveness, it must be a part of our cultural heritage. Systematically applied over time, it would create generational effects which would result in a true deterrent effect against murder." Salt Lake Tribune, January 26, 1980. A fairly recent incident in Japan has proved that capital punishment is indeed a deterrent to crime. A few years ago, Japan had one of the worst drug problems of any nation on earth. To solve the ever-rising problem, they instituted capital punishment for everyone caught peddling dope. Victims of dope were not punished. Today, Japan has one of the least problems with narcotics of any nation in the world. Deputy Attorney General Demer also accepts the fact that capital punishment is a deterrent to crime. Lambasting arguments opposing the death penalty, Demer said the question of whether capital punishment is a deterrent to crime is moot because no one ever asks would-be criminals who were deterred. It only has to deter one person to be effective, the Deputy Attorney General said. He said also that those who claim the death penalty is discriminatory are not looking at the crimes committed. The hi-fi murderers are alleging they are going to be executed only because they are black, but they are not calling to mind the crime committed or that they were convicted by a jury. Deseret News, January 18, 1979. In Utah, Lance and Kelbach have spoken freely about the joy and excitement they got from murdering people and said that if they were released from prison, they would drive a tank down State Street and kill as many people as possible before they were stopped. Capital punishment would rid the community of such characters. Even a life sentence can be shortened, and the criminal may be paroled after serving only 15 years. Then he would be free to roam the streets to kill again. In the late 1950s, there were several active anti-death penalty groups trying to abolish the death penalty. From the following table it can be seen that after many states abolished capital punishment, they later restored it, recognizing that it had more merit than fault. Table 1. Abolition of capital punishment in the United States. Date of State abolition, restoration, re-abolition. Michigan 1846 A. Rhode Island 1852 B. Wisconsin 1853. Iowa 1872-1878. Maine 1876 C. 1883-1887. Colorado 1897-1901. Kansas 1907 D. 1935. Minnesota 1911. Washington 1913-1919, Oregon 1915-1920, North Dakota 1915, South Dakota 1915-1939, Tennessee 1915-1917, Arizona 1916-1918, Missouri 1917-1919, Puerto Rico 1929, Alaska 1957, Hawaii 1957, Delaware, 1958-1961. A death penalty retained for treason. B. Death penalty restored in 1882 for any life-term convict who commits murder. C. In 1837, the Maine law was passed, providing that no condemned person was to be executed until 1 year after his conviction, and then only upon warrant from the governor. There seem to have been no executions under this law between 1837 and 1876. D. In 1872, Kansas passed a law similar to the Maine law and with a comparable effect on executions. See Note C above. Activist groups achieved one of their greatest victories when they convinced the Supreme Court to halt any further capital punishments in this country. The Attorney General of Utah, Robert Hansen, said, "There has been a feeling we pass laws but don't carry them out. If we don't have a respect for the law, we become a government of men and not a government of law." In the early 70s, the Gallup poll reported that over 65% of the American people favored the death penalty. In Utah, it has been reported to be 80%. But in America, as in many other nations, even though the majority of the citizens favor capital punishment, the legislators often reject the majority opinion and implement laws against it, as illustrated in the articles below. 8A. The Salt Lake Tribune, Saturday, September 19, 1981. Guillotine silenced. France ends death penalty. Reuters News Agency. Paris. The French National Assembly Friday approved a bill abolishing the death penalty, scrapping the guillotine, nearly 200 years after it was introduced during the French Revolution. Deputies adopted the bill by 363 votes to 117, rejecting an amendment put up by opposition neo-Gaullist members to set a mandatory prison term for murderers. The bill, one of the planks of Socialist President François Mitterrand's election platform, now goes for a second reading to the Senate, which could hold up implementation, but has no power of veto. Mitterrand, who took office in May, has made no secret of his abhorrence of capital punishment, despite a recent opinion poll showing 62% of the French favoring its retention and only 33% for abolition. His bill, which goes further than those of most European countries by its unconditional abolition of capital punishment, means a reprieve for 6 Frenchmen at present on death row. Joins 9 partners. France's 9 European Economic Community partners have all either ended capital punishment formally or allowed it to fall into disuse. The blade of Dr. Joseph Guillotin's invention first fell in 1792 during the French Revolution's reign of terror. Its chilling reputation was assured after King Louis XVI, Queen Marie Antoinette and hundreds of others were executed. It was last used in 1977 when immigrant worker Hamida Jandoubi, convicted of torturing and murdering his 20-year-old girlfriend, was executed. One of President Mitterrand's first acts after taking office was to commute the death sentence of a 25-year-old man condemned for killing a policeman. Rate poll: 89% disagree with Supreme Court. Should the Supreme Court have ruled that the death penalty is illegal punishment for rape? Yes 10.97%, number 89.03%. An overwhelming majority of Inquirer readers disagree with the Supreme Court that the death penalty for the crime of rape is cruel and unusual punishment and is therefore forbidden by the Constitution. The readers responded to a poll in our July 26 issue, and the first results show that of 1,441 ballots cast, 1,283 or 89.03% voted no on the question. Should the Supreme Court have ruled that the death penalty is illegal punishment for the crime of rape? Only 158 readers, or 10.97% of those voting, agreed with the Supreme Court's decision. National Enquirer. January 23, 1979. Not only should there be capital punishment for the most heinous crimes, but also legislation that would compensate the victims or their families. Interestingly enough, Utah is the only state in the Union which permits an execution according to Bible doctrine. It also has had an option for criminals condemned to die in Utah to choose the manner in which they want to die. For many years it was shooting or hanging, but today it is shooting or drug injection. Some condemned men never lose their sense of humor, even when faced with capital punishment. It was about 1920 that Joseph Hillstrom, a communist socialist better known as Joe Hill, was sentenced to death for killing a grocer. When given a choice of hanging or firing squad, he asked which would cost the state the most money. The reply was hanging because it required building a scaffold, so that was his choice. His last request was that his body be sent to Wyoming because he didn't want to be found dead in the state of Utah. Another man who was sentenced to death chose the firing squad as the means of execution. When asked what his last request was, he answered that he wanted to wear a bulletproof vest. A few criminals recognize the enormity of their crime, seek for justice, and request death as their punishment. But through the technicalities of the law, overzealous lawyers, and special interest groups, the just merits of punishment are often circumvented. The Gary Gilmore case is an example. After the capture of Gary Gilmore, a convicted murderer, he became fully aware of the enormity of his crime and demanded capital punishment, according to the mandates of the law. It was then that officials spent more time and money avoiding his capital punishment than they did in his capture and conviction. Gary's stand erupted into a national news item. Copyright, November 30, 1976. The Salt Lake Tribune, all rights reserved. By George A. Sorensen, Tribune Suburban Editor. Draper. In an exclusive interview with the Salt Lake Tribune, condemned murderer Gary Mark Gilmore Monday night reiterated his wish to be executed, saying, "You can't take someone's life or do some wrong, and then start to sniffle, because you are punished." Gilmore, sentenced to die for the murder of Benny Bushnell last July during a robbery at a Provo motel, said he felt the death sentence is proper. He said he does not wish to spend another 18 or 20 years in prison, and believes he is being practical in accepting the sentence. Gilmore will appear before the Board of Pardons Tuesday morning. The board was asked by Governor Calvin L. Rampton to review the court's death sentence. Gilmore said he had no prepared statement for the board, but will keep his comments short, brief, simple, and to the point. "I will ask them to simply accept the sentence given to me by the judge, jury, and the Utah Supreme Court, and I hope to make this clear to them," Gilmore said. Convicted murderer Gary Mark Gilmore leaves Utah Supreme Court Wednesday after asking that he be allowed to die. Finally, on January 17, 1977, 4 bullets ended the life of Gary Mark Gilmore at the Utah State Prison. After a dramatic struggle for execution, Gary became more of a hero for justice than the officials who opposed his request. All of the prophets of God have sanctioned capital punishment for some civil and even some religious transgressions. True justice, civil or religious, should make punishment equal to the enormity of the crime. Paul the Apostle was one of those prophets who advocated capital punishment, as did Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. But, as a sidelight, it's all in the perspective of the beholder. Consider the beliefs of Cortez and Montezuma. when Montezuma, the Emperor of Mexico, went to submit himself to Hernando Cortés, the conqueror of his country, it was one of the most dramatic meetings to have ever occurred. During the meeting, Cortés chided Montezuma for his bloody method of executing his enemies and criminals to appease his god. Montezuma retorted to the Catholic victor by saying that he did not think it was as bad as his religious ceremony, which consisted of eating the flesh and drinking the blood of his own god. See Gods, Graves and Scholars, by Siren, page 337. Montezuma II, Emperor of Mexico, wrote in a magnificent letter to meet the conqueror of his country, Hernando Cortés. The Savior spoke very strongly in favor of capital punishment when he said, "But those mine enemies, which would not that I should reign over them, bring hither, and slay them before me." Luke 19:27. Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, though definitely advocating capital punishment, spoke much less severely, and were never recorded to have said that their enemies who did not approve of their reign over them should be brought up and slain before them. From martyrdom to massacre. The United States and the Mormons have taken opposite viewpoints on the shedding of blood. The enemies of Mormonism throughout this country generally do not believe in blood atonement, except when it is the blood of the Mormons that is to be spilled. In 1844, in the state of Illinois, a band of militia, some local ministers and citizens numbering over 200, gathered to shoot Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. The nation as a whole, silently and sometimes vocally, approved of the deed, and of course no one was ever sent to jail or fined for their participation. Therefore, they continued to murder, plunder and drive the Mormons from the United States. Death of Joseph Smith depicted. Other anti-Mormon elements continued to contend against the Mormon people. In 1870, J.H. Beadle wrote a book entitled Brigham's Destroying Angel. This was supposed to be the life, confessions, and startling disclosures of Bill Hickman, the Danite chief of Utah. These two men, Beadle and Hickman, in their unbiased, benevolent, and Christian approach, said that Mormonism is sanctified selfishness, and it teaches that very little restraint need be put upon the baser passions, that their gospel is a product of mental slavery, and is a pretense to divine power, blasphemous utterances and contemptible gibberish. They proclaim that Mormonism is Mohammedanism Yankeeized, and that the Mormon Church cannot peaceably continue in America. Furthermore, the Mormon Church is such that it cannot exist under a Republican government or civilized country without constant collision, and that the Church must rule the country it occupies or cease to exist. Their honest opinion was that while it endures, it is a grievous local tyranny, and that its doctrines produce terrible effects. As spokesmen for Christian virtues, they observe that love, forgiveness, kindly charity must wither in such an air as that of Mormonism. Amidst pages and pages of such fair and impartial statements, they conclude by saying, Mormons in Utah are essentially a foreign community governed by a few swindling Yankees, holding to just so much of original Mormonism as serves their purpose. See the preface of Brigham's Destroying Angel. Beadle was an anti-Mormon with few equals, and anything he could write to damage the Mormons, he was eager to do. Bill Hickman, a renegade and apostate, sold himself for a price. The combination made unique publishing business. The picture below was printed in 1884 by William Jarman in a book called Hell on Earth. It is a favorite among the anti-Mormons and is still being reproduced to describe Mormon religious ceremonies. It is reprinted in such books today as The Inside Story of Mormonism. Picture of the Reformation in Utah. Slaying of a Woman for Betraying Endowment Secrets, from Hell on Earth by William Jarman, 1884. This picture shows a man standing near the woman getting her throat cut. The man, probably supposed to be the husband, must be there as a witness and approve of the act, but can't bear the sight of the deed. To make the picture more revolting, two young children had to be there, but crying and clutching on to their father, they are grieving to see the execution of their mother. The huge book on the altar must be a Book of Mormon, because no Christian would suppose that such a thing ever occurred in the Bible. The skull on the altar is convincing proof that the whole affair is an evil and superstitious rite. The men in the background are probably also witnesses, who must be there to approve of the method of execution. This kind of ceremony has constantly been proclaimed by the anti-Mormon rabble as part of their temple rituals. Similar illustrations became gospel for the Protestant evangelists, but merely sick humor for the Mormons. Many other anti-Mormon writers, like Josiah F. Gibbs, used every bit of false information conceivable in their attempts to condemn or accuse the Mormon people. Gibbs wrote a book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre and said that he was going to write it, with malice toward none, least of all toward the misguided assassins, and in a spirit of even-handed justice, the attempt will be made to assemble the fragments of causation and history, and join them together in a consecutive narration. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, Gibbs, page 5. Then page after page he speaks of Mormonism as consisting of religion-crazed fanatics whose religion is a deadening, damning influence to be exterminated. The Mormon leaders were teachers of grotesquely exaggerated views of the religious and political mission of Mormonism and of their own importance. In his careful and unbiased scrutiny of Mormonism, he declared that there is not a devout Mormon on earth who would not commit murder if he were ordered to do so by the chief prophet or one of his agents in whom he had confidence. And then, add to that combination the fact that those blood atonement executions are to be carried out under the authority of the leader of a religious organization and not under any civil process. Gibbs then refers to the Reformation period just prior to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, when the church asked all members to renew their faith by being rebaptized and to repent from their sins. This, he says, was a time of confession, of the renewal of covenants by rebaptism, and the intensification of indescribable fanaticism, frenzy, and violence. Then he proceeds to relate his unbiased report of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Had Gibbs, like so many of the anti-Mormons who spew out their venom, lived 2,000 years ago, he would probably have gladly helped the Romans pound nails into the fanatical anti-ecclesiastical political rabble-rouser known as Christ. Thus, as the controversy continued between the Mormons and the world, the saints were mobbed and murdered from New York to Ohio, and from there to Missouri. In Missouri, General Lucas ordered all the leaders of the church to be led before a firing squad and shot. Fortunately, the orders were never carried out, but the final toll of murdered Mormons reached over 450 in Missouri. The rest barely escaped with their lives. From Missouri they settled in Illinois, where more robbing, raping, burning, and murdering caused 22,000 Mormons to leave in the dead of winter for the wilderness of the West. After a loss in millions of dollars and over 6,000 graves along the route, they established new homes in the West. But in 10 years the United States sent an army out to again put down the Mormons. The government troops offered $100 for each Mormon scalp that the Indians would bring them. These were the acts of the Christian people against the Mormons. The truth of the bloody Old West. Who were the real heroes and villains in the Old West? The world in general looked upon some characters as their heroes, but in reality these characters were cowardly killers. Historians are unraveling much of the truth from fiction in the old frontier. Matt Braun, author of 19 books on the Wild Wild West, has put together these genuine and interesting facts. 1. The fast draw and invention of Hollywood, it was exceptionally rare. 2. The bounty hunter, there were no such men. Rewards were usually split among a posse or lawmen. 3. The two-gun man, many carried 2 guns, but usually one was used only as a backup. 4. Fanning the gun, shown so much in movies, was the invention of the dime novelists. 5. The noble gunfighter, a term that was not even used in those times. Both lawmen and outlaws usually shot to stay alive. But the most interesting facts of history have proved that the Wild West heroes were not really heroes at all, as the public have been led to believe. Let's consider a few examples. Wyatt Earp, his principal claim to fame was the shootout at the OK Corral. It was an ambush in which Earp and his 2 brothers gunned down 3 men, and only 2 were armed. Bat Masterson was a sports writer for the New York Morning Telegraph and created his own fairy tale about being a Western gunfighter. He portrayed himself as a lightning-fast gunslinger who had killed 26 men. The truth is that he killed only 1 man, who was shot in a barroom brawl over a prostitute. Photo of Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp. Billy the Kid, his reputation for killing 21 men, 1 for each year of his life, is another Western fable. In reality, he killed 9 men, 8 of them gunned down without a chance. Some historians think that his was a pathological case. Photo of Billy the Kid. Jesse James, often called the Robin Hood of the West, was really a social misfit who suffered from paranoia. Unlike Robin Hood, who stole to give to the poor, he stole and his charity ended with himself. Photo of Jesse James. On the other hand, Porter Rockwell, accused of gunning down people unjustly, was really carrying out his duties as a deputy marshal of the Utah Territory. He was wrongly labeled as the leader of the Danites because of his many shootouts with outlaws. But other marshals and deputies all over the West were doing the same thing and being made heroes for it. Since Rockwell was a Mormon, he was condemned when he carried out the responsibilities of his office. Photo of Porter Rockwell. Brigham Young, like Porter Rockwell, was classed by the world as a bloodthirsty, wicked murderer. He often talked about carrying pistols which were loaded and ready to put men in their graves, etc. But this served only to warn or scare many who thought of killing him. He confessed that he had never shed the blood of any man, and his advice to his fellow Mormons was usually the same as it was given to the saints on March 21, 1858, in the Tabernacle. Brother Brigham spoke a little on the rise and persecution of the church, said it was not policy to shed the blood of our enemies, and was better to leave our homes than to be driven from them. Charles Walker Journal, March 21, 1858. And again a month later. Brigham made some good remarks, said he felt righteously mad enough to go right out to the camp of our enemies and slay them, said he would have to hold back and let the wicked slay the wicked, showed that if we spilled their blood there was an atonement, but if we let them kill themselves, they would go to hell and stay there. Charles Walker Journal, April 4, 1858. It is in these statements that Brigham Young shows respect for the doctrine of atonement, knowing that those who are worthy of it, but do not obtain it, are worse off. Even if Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball or other Mormon leaders would have stood as executioners upon men guilty of capital crimes, it would not have marred their position before God. For example, Moses killed an Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. CX 2:12. He was still worthy to be a prophet to Israel. Also, after he died, he came with Elias when Christ was transfigured, and his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. Matt 17:3. This was one of the greatest moments in the life of Christ, yet Moses, who had killed a man, was there for the occasion. Moses had acted as an executioner, not as a murderer. Therefore, in justification of Porter Rockwell, he was not guilty of murder, but only acted according to law and justice. The only restriction or limitation placed by God upon someone who has shed blood is that he cannot build or work upon a temple of God. This is clearly illustrated in the life of David. And David said to Solomon, "My son, as for me, it was in my mind to build an house unto the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Thou hast shed blood abundantly, and hast made great wars. Thou shalt not build an house unto my name, because thou hast shed much blood upon the earth in my sight. Behold, a son shall be born to thee, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies round about. For his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quietness unto Israel in his days. He shall build an house for my name." Icron 22:7-10. Hence, men who have killed others in war, self-defense or who have been executioners, are not guilty of murder, nor will they receive the displeasure of God when such acts are justified. Doctrinal summary. The Mormon Church has never had to perform the kinds of bloodshed that God ordered Israel to do. The Bible is full of divine injunctions to the Israelites to go kill every man, woman, child and animal of the surrounding communities. If you took the worst crime that could be found among the Mormons and multiplied it by 1,000 times, it would still not equal the enormity of some of the destructions committed by the children of Israel under the direction of God. If the Protestant and Catholic ministers and priests of today lived in the days of Moses, Joshua, Samson, David and other prophets, they would have been just as active in their protests against their doctrine and practice of blood atonement as they are now against the Mormons. They believe God has changed that doctrine, making him a changeable God, but he does not change. See Malachi 3:6 and Hebrews 13:8. The fallacy in the doctrines of atonement as believed by most modern ministers is portrayed in the following somewhat humorous characterization. Cartoon of murderer making last-second lip service to repentance. You're under arrest for robbery and murder? Okay, just don't shoot. If you believe in Jesus you will be saved. What have I got to lose? I believe. He believes. Hallelujah. He's saved. But what about the banker? I wish I had been given more time to say I believe. The Apostle Paul tells us that where there is no law, there is no punishment. Conversely, we can say that where there is a law, there must also be a punishment for disobedience. We can further reason that the greater the laws, the greater the punishments. Every person who is baptized does so with an oath and to accept and abide by the doctrines and principles of the gospel. However, ministers and religious leaders soon manhandle the gospel by throwing out parts and pieces, and soon preach another gospel. God will be more severe in his judgments against these who claim to be his servants than most others. It is for this reason that he has said the judgments must begin upon his own house first. God's judgments will be felt in the political as well as the religious realm. For instance, men in every agency of government, from the president down to the common laborer, must take an oath and swear that they will support and defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign or domestic, so help me God. Yet, as soon as many men get into office, they begin to reject or overthrow the principles of freedom as guaranteed by the Constitution. They might take those oaths lightly, but God does not. President Wilford Woodruff said that the Constitution once broken by the rulers of the land, there will be no stopping place until the nation is broken in pieces, and no power beneath the heavens can save this nation from the consequences thereof. Mill. Star 41-241, he also saw and visioned the destructions that are coming upon this nation, and described dead bodies upon dead bodies in Washington, D.C. Joseph Smith said, I testify again, as the Lord lives, God never will acknowledge any traitors or apostates. TPJS, page 375, yet traitors and apostates are dominating most Americans today. In that great day when all mankind shall stand before God in judgment, every man will receive the fruits of his labors on earth. None will escape judgment, for every idle word shall be brought into judgment, so that every man will be apportioned a just compensation for the blessings and punishments will be faultless, and no man will be able to complain of injustice that he received too little reward or too much punishment. In that day every man shall understand perfectly the doctrine of blood atonement.